Well, I think we can start. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning or good day, wherever you are. Ramadan Kareem to all those who are observing the holy month. Just before starting, on behalf of IBBC family, I would like to send deep condolences to the families and loved ones of those victims of the tragic incident in Al Khatib Hospital in Baghdad, and our prayers that those injured for speedy recovery. Very sad. Well, thank you all for joining this IBBC webinar to discuss Professor Frank Gunter's recent paper titled Corruption Worse Than ISIS, Causes and Cures for Iraqi Corruption. I hope you'll find the discussions interesting and useful. Today we have a very distinguished panel. First, Professor Frank Gunter, who's a professor of economics at the Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, and is also a senior fellow in Foreign Policy Research Institute. Frank has several research papers and publications on the economies of Iraq and China, and has done consultancies on Iraqi economic development issues covering impact of corruption, oil prices, state-owned enterprises, and budget. Then we have on the panel Ms. Maya Jbeli, who is a reporter covering conflict, human rights, and economic affairs in the Middle East. Maya recently joined Thomson Reuters Foundation, and just before that, few months ago, until a few months ago, she was based in Iraq for Agence France Presse. She also covered war against the so-called Islamic State in Raqqa. Maya herself recently published an article for Agence France Presse on corruption in Iraqi customs. And last but not least is Dr. Renard Monsoor of Chatham House. Renard is a senior research fellow at Chatham House and at the American University of Iraq in Slemania, and also at the Cambridge Security Initiative based at Cambridge University. Dr. Mansoor has written expert comments and researches on Iraq, Iran, and Kurdish affairs. He is knowledgeable of Iraqi politics, and his presence today on the panel, maybe he can tell us how he sees the direction and the momentum of Iraq's war against corruption. So I'll start with Professor Frank Gunter, who made a lot of effort and hard work to put this paper together. Frank, maybe you can highlight for us the main points that you think are important for our audience and for the public to hear. Frank, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, good morning or good afternoon, whatever's appropriate. I'd like to start by saying I greatly appreciate the support and the encouragement of the IBBC and especially the Advisory Council and their interest in my research on the political economy of Iraq. You have my paper on the causes and possible cures of corruption in Iraq. So in order to maximize the time that we'll have for discussion, I'd like to focus my talk on two of the 6 components of Iraq's anti-corruption strategy. Now, as everybody knows, Iraq ranks very poorly on Transparency International. It ranks 160th of the countries listed. But during the last month, there have been several studies that have added detail to the devastating impact of corruption on Iraq's polity, society, and economy. One of the panelists, Maya, as the chair just mentioned, has just published a detailed look at corruption on Iraq's borders that seems to be diverting billions of dollars from the government into the pockets of crooked officials and the insurgent groups. Ahmed Mayer recently published an article on how government jobs are sold for cash within the last week. The government of Iraq has made several recent announcements intending to publicize its anti-corruption efforts. Last week, the Prime Minister suspended the operating licenses for 1,128 unfinished investment projects on suspicion that the project funds were being looted. In addition, the Commission of Integrity issued arrest warrants for 58 officials on corruption charges. A senior politician and party leader was arrested. These anti-corruption efforts are important. However, they focus on reducing the supply of corrupt acts by government officials. Reducing the supply of corrupt acts is necessary, but it's not sufficient to substantially reduce corruption for an extended period of time. There have been many failures at anti-corruption strategies, but the few successful anti-corruption strategies have coordinated both a reduction in the supply of corrupt acts as well as efforts to reduce the demand for such corrupt acts by the public. Another question that is controversial in the corruption field is whether the focus should be on grand corruption, where taking over the government, corruption at the highest levels of the Iraqi government, or whether the focus should be on the petty corruption, corruption at the bottom of the pyramid of small businesses and individuals having to pay corruption of a few thousand dinar on an hourly or daily basis. Personally, I think the focus should be on petty corruption because that is the major barrier to increase private sector employment. So what's the motivation? The motivation behind the study of corruption. Every year, about 900,000 Iraqis become old enough to start working. Even after you adjust for retirement and the low labor force participation rate among women, every year Iraq has to create 350,000, a third of a million more new jobs just to keep the unemployment and the unemployment rates from rising. 350,000 a year. Since 2014, as a result of ISIS and as a result of the collapse in oil prices, Iraq has not been able to create these jobs. My estimate, there's no good data, my estimate is that 80% of the young Iraqi males are either unemployed or underemployed. Not only is there an economic loss here, but it is politically destabilizing. So I think it is critical to reduce the demand for corrupt acts by the private sector in order to allow the creation of jobs by the private sector. All right. In the paper, I note that there are 6 components that the many failures and the few successes of anti-corruption policy have had. I'd like to focus on 2 of those components that are intended to reduce the demand for corrupt acts: changing the culture of corruption and reducing economic incentives for corruption. Changing the corruption. Changing culture is hard. Changing culture is hard. What has worked elsewhere? What are the essentials? First of all, you have to have an unambiguous definition of what corruption is. Everybody knows corruption is the use of public office for private benefit. But if you're going to have a successful anti-corruption policy, you have to be specific. For example, is there a minimum level of bribes below which the police are not interested, the anti-corruption officials are not interested? Is giving a cup of tea to a policeman, is that below that level and therefore we don't care? Or should the definition be an unambiguous not 1 dinar, not 1 dinar? Another issue, should there be amnesty? Should there be amnesty? Among the few successful anti-corruption strategies, such as in Hong Kong and Singapore, they both had amnesty. It's interesting that in Hong Kong, originally there was no amnesty, and the police didn't support the program. They wouldn't enforce the anti-corruption regulations because most, if not all, the police officers had been corrupt. So the government changed the law to allow an amnesty. Everything that happened before this date, the government is not interested. After this date, you can be brought up on charges. That brought in the support of the police. So should there be an amnesty? Should there be a minimum level? The second essential for changing the culture is to get influential voices speaking against corruption. Now, who are those influential voices? I participated, or didn't participate, I was watching a focus group in Iraq where they had politicians and sports stars speaking against corruption. And the focus group of Iraqis actually burst into laughter. They actually laughed at the idea of a politician or a sports star speaking against corruption. It was just too absurd. Who is respected when they're an anti-corruption voice? It appears that at least 3. First of all, religious leaders, when they speak against corruption, and the Friday sermon seems to have an impact. The protesters, who have been protesting in the street for 2 years, the families of the protesters who have been murdered, they seem to be listened to when anti-corruption is spoken. And finally, writers. Writers seem to have an influence on the attitudes. The third and final component of changing the culture in the few successes has been educate the young. You can't wait until they're college. You can't wait until they've just started working. You have to start the anti-corruption education when they're in elementary school, when they're 5 years old. The intent is that if the anti-corruption message is provided at that young age, hopefully not only will they grow up to be against corruption, but as they grow up, as they become children, teenagers, and young adults, they'll be less tolerant of corruption among their friends and neighbors and family. A second means of reducing the demand for corrupt acts is to reduce the economic incentives for corruption. Now, fighting corruption by reducing the economic incentives was a key component of the first post-Saddam National Development Strategy, 2005. But since then, if you look at the 4 economic development strategies that have occurred since then, anti-corruption by reducing the economic incentives has dropped out. What are the options? There's 2 options. One option is reducing subsidies. Iraq, as everybody knows, has low or zero official prices. I put the word emphasis on the word official prices for food, electricity, fuel, water, medical care, education, etc. Okay. As a result of these zero or low official prices, the amount demanded of these goods and services is much greater than the amount supplied. The people of Iraq want much more clean water, electricity, education, and healthcare than the system is providing at the official price. So families are competing with each other for these scarce goods and services. Maybe they use political pull, maybe they use tribal membership, maybe they use religious connections. But a very common way that one family can get these scarce government-provided goods and services that another family can't is through bribes. Well, there's a side issue that Iraq cannot afford these subsidies, but one possibility for eliminating these subsidies or reducing these subsidies in order to reduce the demand for corrupt acts is get rid of the subsidies. But if you do that, it's going to cause an incredible hardship on low-income Iraqis. So what would be needed would be to reduce or eliminate the subsidies at the same time that there's an increase in the transfer payments made directly to the poor families so that they're able to obtain the scarce goods and services at a reasonable price. Next is reducing the complexity of the commercial code. Iraq's commercial code is extremely complex. It's 154th as far as starting a new business. Getting credit. Iraq is the worst in the Middle East and Northern Africa when it comes to getting credit. Now consider the competition. To be the worst is saying something. Trading across borders. Iraq comes in 181st out of 189. Closing a business, Iraq is tied for the worst in the world. So the regulations, the commercial code of Iraq makes it extremely difficult, expensive, and complex to start a business, to hire people. An example, in Iraq, currently it takes 167 days to legally get permission to build a warehouse. Not to build a warehouse, but to get permission to build a warehouse. Or you can put a couple of $100 bills, the bribes are paid in American dollars, put a couple of $100 bills in an envelope, and you can get your permission within 2 weeks. Schwan, if I run over, please give me the cutthroat sign and I'll shut up.
Well, I'll give you a couple of minutes. I mean, yes,
Very
you're
good.
reaching. Thank you.
Why is the commercial code so complex? Well, it's not an unloved artifact of Saddam era. Each of these complex, expensive, unnecessary regulations is carefully preserved, because the more complex, illogical, and time-consuming the procedures are, the greater the number and size of the bribes that can be extorted from businesses. So if you could rationalize the commercial code, if instead of taking 167 days to get permission to build a warehouse, it only took 30 days, then the businesses were either not going to offer a bribe at all, waiting 30 days is not that serious, or the bribe is going to get smaller. So by reducing the complexity of the commercial code, you reduce the demand for corrupt acts. There is progress being made in reducing the subsidies and rationalizing the business regulations, but Iraq is running out of time. This politically destabilizing army of unemployed and underemployed of young men keeps growing year after year. The protests are now, despite the 700 deaths, the protests are now in their second year. Something has to be done and has to be done quickly. So, Schwan, and I appreciate
Yes, thank you, Frank, really. I mean, well, thank you very much, and very interesting points you raised, and I'm sure we have many more points to discuss and present to us, but time is, I mean, we have a time limit. Maya, as a journalist and your knowledge of Iraq and public views in Iraq, how do you see the issue of corruption and points raised by Frank?
Thanks so much,
Maya.
and thanks for the opportunity to speak. And I'd like to add my voice to yours and expressing condolences for those who died in the fire over the weekend. And already there have been some voices that have discussed this really horrifying incident as a result of endemic corruption, particularly in the health sector and the poor equipment these hospitals are unfortunately stuck with. But we can talk about that in a bit. So I spent 2.5 years in Iraq, and I basically capped my time there with a kind of in-depth look at corruption. But I was exposed to it throughout the time that I was there. I mean, references from colleagues, anecdotes from friends, and kind of just stumbling upon instances of corruption throughout my time there. And it really is everywhere. I mean, it's in every possible sector. It's, you know, I focused on it when it came to Iraqi imports, but I was also looking potentially at doing stories on corruption in the health sector, corruption in education, corruption in land appropriation. So it really is endemic, and it's in every single part of society and of an individual's daily life. I mean, I'll give you one anecdote from a colleague who was basically, I mean, it sums up kind of how widespread it is, but also the widespread resignation that it's basically here to stay. Where a colleague was basically saying, you know, we're fine if in these big public contracts, these companies and these contractors end up stealing, but at least just build the thing that you were meant to build. I mean, take a chunk of the money if you have to steal it, that's fine, but at least build the school or build the hospital. So it just shows you kind of how resigned they are to corruption just being a part of, especially the public sector, but how little hope they have in anything being seriously done about it. And I'll make a few references here to Dr. Gunter's paper. I think one of the most important elements that he discussed in detail are the effects of widespread corruption, especially when it comes to infrastructure. And he references, you know, houses not being built, schools not being constructed, hospitals not being repaired, etc. And again, this is a point that I think a lot of people are trying to link to the recent tragedy, in that this corruption really does have a deadly impact. I mean, we're not just saying kind of, you know, a deal here or there that allows people to make some money on the side. It has a very real impact on people's lives. And one of the stories that I worked on, actually was a series of stories on corruption that I published last month, included a profile of a family based in Karbala. As a father of four who is out of work, and who, in his mind, directly links corruption to his desperate desire to leave Iraq. I mean, again, in a lot of the problems that Dr. Gunter brings up in his report are exactly what this man was referencing. He was saying, I can't afford healthcare unless I pay a bribe. My kids can't get into school unless I pay a bribe. The roads outside my home are unpaved because the local contractor was basically just awarded the contract and left and never had to do anything for us. So he's saying that he wants to leave the country. He wants to leave his homeland because he sees no way of surviving in the current in his day-to-day life. So it's not just a political or kind of distant idea for many Iraqi citizens. It is their lives, and it directly impacts their lives. And especially young people, not just fathers, not just kind of people that have the historical context, but a lot of young friends just see door after door closed to them because they have to pay to get a job, because they have to have the right connections to be able to get funding for their projects. So they want to emigrate, and they see very, very little hope in their homeland, again, because of this endemic culture that they find. I would also agree with the point on weak legal sanctions. I mean, one of the stories that I started to work on but didn't have time to finish actually is about why we don't see, I mean, since everyone talks about corruption, everyone seems to agree it's bad, and every prime minister seems to start some kind of anti-corruption initiative or council, why don't we see it being rooted out? Unfortunately, the main issue that I repeatedly heard was that you can't trust the courts. I mean, there is no independent judiciary that will actually put people behind bars for long enough to create a real deterrent. So even in the cases where we do see the Integrity Commission issue an arrest warrant or even put somebody behind bars, they get out if they repay the amount that they stole. In the meantime, they may have used that money to then make even more money, but they wouldn't have to return kind of whatever they were able to invest in and make off of the original amounts. And again, as Dr. Gunter explained, you know, when politicians or sports stars come on TV, or any kind of other public figure come on TV or make any public effort to combat corruption, it's often met with laughs. And you know, one worker in my interviews during my reporting on the port story and on corruption in imports, there was a TV actually playing in the background, and there was an MP that was on one of these high-profile talk shows, and he pointed to the TV and he was like, "See, MPs come on TV and they talk about corruption only in the instances when they didn't get a cut in a deal that they were expecting to get a cut in." So there's also this perception that, you know, any kind of you know, public move by a public official is driven more by an intent to be corrupt than an intent to stop corruption. So,
okay,
you know,
I am sorry, really. I have to be strict on time because so if I may, I'll come back to you with
no problem.
a couple of
Thanks.
questions. Well, thank you very much on very interesting points. Renard, now knowledgeable of Iraqi politics and having contacts and people whom you know within the Iraqi political circles, how do you see the paper? How do you assess it, the recommendations in it, and do you think it will be received by them, by the politicians, positively, or how much will they cooperate to implement it or implement its recommendations? Renard, the floor is yours.
Sure. And thank you, Shwan, for the introduction, to the IBBC for holding this, and to Maya and to Frank. And thanks to Frank for the paper. I think what I could do is add a bit more on what I've been focusing on when it comes to this question, and perhaps add something to Frank's presentation, which, you know, and the paper, which is quite comprehensive in looking at different types of corruption. And very much looking at how corruption has been understood in Iraq since 2003. Corruption being a product of personal greed, of theft, of bribery, graft, smuggling, and all of that. And you very much see that in Frank's paper, in the legacies of corruption. And so the key and one of the solutions is if you can just educate young people to teach them that corruption is bad, maybe when they grow up, they will keep those lessons in mind. And I suppose sort of where I want to sort of add to this is to kind of look at, well, what happens when we're talking about an entire political system? What if, you know, we're using a word corruption, but really that corruption and using the word corruption stops us from really understanding how the entire political system functions? What if, you know, when we, and the paper makes this sort of evocative sort of title, has a title, which is Corruption is Worse Than ISIS. But what we knew about ISIS was that it was more of a symptom than the root, right? And that it will continue to come back, and that you could tackle it one way by militarily striking it, but you would never remove its roots. But what if corruption is simply, the petty corruption is simply the roots of something much larger? And so what if we should actually address what is much larger? And so that to me is I guess, because of my interest, something that I'm more interested in. So while the paper mentions all these facts and all of these details of what corruption could look like, there's maybe one or two very important paragraphs in it looking at the political system, looking at the special grades, looking at ministries, that to me should devote much more than, let's say, the economic research done in the past on whether countries that have cousins marrying each other are more prone to be corrupt, or whether Muslim and Catholic countries are more prone to be corrupt. There should, there's one line on special grades and one line on wikala, which to me is the heart of what we're talking about, right? The bribery is so small compared to this. I mean, I spoke to a very senior official in one of the ministries recently. He told me at his estimate, $80 billion has been taken just through contracting, right? Why is it that in Iraq, every time a new minister enters office, part of the first week of orientation is going to the party bosses that control that ministry and coming to an agreement as to how much can change and how much has to stay the same? Who you touch, who you don't touch, which employees in each ministry, whether it's in different director generals all the way down to legal clerks in the ministry, are what are known as the untouchables, right? So here we're talking about an entire political system, right? And this is the legacies of what was built after 2003, but perhaps some of the laws that predate 2003. And so, to me, that is really a focus that I and others, Toby Dodge and others, will be looking at. How each political party has proxies, whether it's under a wikala contract or actually passed through in each ministry. How, as we move on since 2003, what we're seeing is weaker and weaker prime ministers, weaker and weaker ministers, and stronger senior bureaucrats, right? The power is no longer in those bureaucrats that are the ones, in the ministers and prime ministers that are the ones who are meant to be formally in charge. That, to me, I think is something that would be great to sort of add to the discussion on what is petty corruption and the 10,000 bribe here, 5,000 bribe there, right? And it's not just the ministries, but how much each MP pays or has to be backed with money to get that position. And so every elections, the money is just crazy, 1 million per MP and all of this. I mean, this is the stuff the system that I think is not very well known, but I think that needs to be, uncovered to really understand these issues. And so the final point on this then becomes, what about the connectivity of it all, and whether compartmentalizing isn't that armed group at that border, right, smuggling in, let's say, some kind of agriculture, with a director general in the Ministry of Agriculture that's allowing contractors to go to that group, with foreign forces from neighboring countries, let's say, that are also benefiting from that, with businesses and different Iraqi banks that are allowing letters of credit for the. So this is an entire system of corruption that includes all sorts of people, right? Private sector, public sector, politicians, businesses, and to me, trying to come up with how do you, the questions that I would put forward is, where do you begin with that, right? Because if we do consider this all kind of this network, removing a person doesn't change the system. They can easily replace, right? So for example, if the Q card payment system is a system that is corrupt because politicians are using it, you can remove the head of Q card, but that doesn't remove the system of where the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry and the Central Bank of Iraq have no idea who they're paying, right? So each political party, each group sends not a list of names to the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank to who gets paid, but actually just a number. Give us this number. So the Iraqi government has no idea who it's paying and what it's paying. Right? And we're talking about this is why corruption gets to that point. So I guess that was the point I wanted to add, which was the sort of to focus on the political and the connectivity of these groups. And the final point, I think that there's a big lesson in the protesters, because the message of the protesters from October 2019 is exactly what I've been saying, which is that this is a systemic problem. And so we're not going to go after one political party or one political leader. We're going to go after the entire system. And you have the same in Lebanon, where they say kullun yani kullun. they're all together, right? And so what are the implications of that to a prime minister who comes up through that system, who was put in place by that system, and then goes around and claiming that he will reform the system? I think that I think the implication of that is a prime minister that's unable to ensure that his hospitals are secure enough to save lives. And I think that's what we'll continue to see, because it's the political, to me, that's more important than the bribery. And actually, when I say more important, that I think is at the root of then the bribery and everything else that trickles from it. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you, Renard. Really, thank you very much. You brought very interesting angles to the argument. And I'll come back to you with one or two questions later. Ladies and gentlemen, for the attendees, we received few questions before the event by email, and please, if you have any questions, just put them on the chat. I'll start with the earlier questions we received, and I'll ask each one of the panelists one question. But just in case if time runs out and we can't cover all your questions, which I'm sure that will happen. So just send them by email to london@webuildiraq.org. And we'll try our best to answer those questions. Now back to Frank. Frank, you mentioned in the paper that business costs have increased by 20% due to corruption. Okay. Now, what factors and measurements were applied to get to this estimate or this figure? And in your view, what would be an estimate to lost businesses or business opportunities in Iraq because of corruption and the perception of corruption, particularly for foreign investors? Frank, to you.
Oh, thank you. That's a tough question. I got some criticism from a academic colleague in Iraq on the title. He said that there's no way you can compare ISIS to corruption. I think the challenge is that the damage, and I think Maya already mentioned this, that most of the damage done by corruption is invisible. It's businesses not started, it's roads not built, it's hospitals that can't treat children, it's schools that don't have electricity and don't have running water. It's what doesn't happen. Now, the numbers I provided there were based on surveys, among them Sami Desai, who has done some very interesting work. And she stayed out of Baghdad. She's traveled to the smaller cities, asking business people, what are your actual costs? The fact that it's 20% of revenue is lost to corruption is, to me, the small part of the damage. The big damage is that the firms that are never started, the businesses that are never begun because of the corruption. Foreign investors, especially when you look at what happened with the what do they call the major program to take the salt water and turn it into fresh water. The foreign investors were very interested in that 10 years ago. They're not interested now. And one of the drivers in that is the corruption. So it's always tough to get accurate data, especially micro data from individual businesses. It has to be done on a survey basis with all the challenges involved. But if what we're hearing is correct, the damage is extensive. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Frank. I'll go to Maya. Maya, again, corruption is not static. It's something that can grow and change if nothing is done about it, and become worse over time. And I think this is happening in Iraq. Now, the question is, being a knowledgeable journalist and having a lot of insights on Iraq and Lebanon, how bad do you think it will get in Iraq until the entire system collapses? Or at least, how long will it take until the situation becomes something similar to Lebanon? Maya?
Thanks for the question, Sean. I actually had a cousin of mine about a month ago when I was still in Iraq. She messaged me and said, how long do you think before the situation in Lebanon gets as bad as Iraq? So everyone's kind of seeing the other situation as but it's an important question because there are a lot of similarities, but there are some key differences. I mean, similarities, I think, if we were to really talk about it from a political perspective, there's a problem with the social contract, both in Lebanon and in Iraq, where you're expecting either the state or your political leaders to afford you services, to afford you more so your political leaders to afford you jobs, to afford you education, etc. And you're not expecting it from the state. I think one thing that I always found really, really strange in Iraq is that youth expect the Iraqi state to provide them with jobs in the most part and kind of access to an income and a pension plan, but they appear to be less angry about potholed roads or a lack of services, etc. I mean, it was always, as long as I can get a job, as long as I can have access to a job, I think until 2019, and that really changed things. Another common point is a lack of governance in both countries, a chronic lack of governance and accountability, where you cannot rely again on the court system to hold corrupt individuals or corrupt institutions to account. I think Dr. Gunter mentioned the subsidy programs. That's another common point where you have a really huge portion of state corruption that is kind of seeping off the funds that have to do with subsidies in both countries. So I think there are lessons learned that each country can draw from each other, but I think in both places you see that there is very little political will to attack any of these issues, because I think as Renard was saying, this corruption is the product of a political settlement in both countries. In both countries, you have unresolved tensions, and the way that these tensions are being kind of swept under the rug is by some kind of political settlement that allows for economic resources to be divided up amongst different players, amongst different powerful actors. So whether that's state resources, whether it's contracts, whether it's jobs, I mean, that's the reason why we're not able to see any serious reforms in Lebanon, and we're not able to see any serious reforms in Iraq. It's because there's a political will there. How long before Iraq sees the level of economic collapse that we're seeing in Lebanon? I think a key difference that we have to continue to bring up is the fact that Iraq still has a reliable, so far until now, influx of dollars, and Lebanon does not. I mean, the key reason that we saw the complete collapse of the currency in Lebanon is that dollars were not coming into the country anymore. And now that oil prices are, happily back to some semblance of normal in Iraq, we see an unwillingness to reform on the one hand, but we also see kind of a certain level of stabilization economically. So I don't foresee it. I mean, I'm not sure what the trigger would be in Iraq to see that level of devaluation at that speed that we saw in Lebanon. But Iraq has this kind of, it's a double-edged sword. It's a fail-safe in that it would prevent this kind of collapse that we see in Lebanon, but it also prevents a political will towards real reform of the economic and financial sector.
Well, Maya, you raise a very interesting point. You say that Iraq still has dollars coming into the country, which is true, and that comes from the selling because of selling oil. But with all the campaign, international campaign, and by the superpowers to reduce carbon emission and reliance on oil, I think this luxury also will not stay for long. But again, that's something else to Renard, Maya raised an important topic, and that's political will and good governance. And this is the thing of the question to you is political will and good governance are key to putting in place and empowering an effective anti-corruption strategy. Now, so far, the efforts to reduce corruption or to battle corruption by improving governance have really led to very little progress in Iraq. Now, how do you see, or how do you think that reforms suggested in the white paper that was published last year by the government of Iraq, how do these reforms or will they improve governance systems to be a barrier to preventing, or at least reducing corruption and corrupt practices? Renard?
Sure, thank you. And I think that some of the conclusions from Frank's paper are really helpful to answer this question, particularly the focus on accountability in the judicial system and really enforcing the political system. To answer the first part of the question on political will, there's often, when we talk about so-called reformists, incremental reformists all within the Iraqi political system, the question is will versus ability. And oftentimes those who appear to be most willing are still unable to go against the big party bosses across the spectrum to change the system in which they benefit from. But they're also unwilling to lose their job. And I don't think anyone in the Iraqi system is actually willing to lose their job to go out to pursue good governance. And I'm talking at the highest levels here. And so that there, the will versus ability becomes a problem. So I think it's not a matter of how do you enforce more accountability, as Frank's writing about and as Maya is talking about, within the political system, because we haven't seen that, but how do you sort of work in different avenues to check this political system, right? Let's stop talking about reformists versus conservatives, good versus bad. Let's just assume the political system functions and has its own logic. How do you begin to expose some of that? How can you work, for example, with developing good journalism in Iraq that could begin to scratch the surface on what exactly is happening and how much money is being taken by whom and by what? How do you begin to bring together civil servants within each of the ministries who are genuine reformists, who do have some kind of legitimacy and are capable, but are isolated and stuck in between bigger forces on their own? But how do you bring them together to try and connect the tissues of reform, right? How do you bring together lawyers? Because by the time they become judges, they have to have made so many political deals that it's very difficult for the judiciary at that top level, right? But how do you go to lawyers who might have an interest in pursuing legal mechanisms and give them strength that is an alternative for them having to make the political deals that they do? So to me, these type of systems outside of that political system of the political parties making backroom deals is really the only way to enforce accountability and good governance. It's not going to come from within. It's not going to come from any reformist or any conservative from within the government right now. And so this becomes the sort of, to answer the second question on the white paper, I think there's another logic behind the white papers, and there's a logic in generally from the reformist school within the Iraqi government, which is if you can just isolate the politics from the economics, you can begin to address the economic problems of corruption, making the civil service a bit more, streamlining it, creating procurement boards. You can begin to address it, but don't touch the politics because the politics is very messy. And so let's just short-term focus on the economics and keep the politics out. My response to that is what happens when the politics is so strong that any initiative, any small initiative to try and do economic reform gets completely brought down by the politics. And can we actually separate the politics from the economics? That's the question that I have to the white paper, which takes it from being a wish list, and all of those wish lists we have are the white paper, but turns it into a strategy on, looking not just in 1 or 2 years advance, but where do we want to be 40 years from now? And what is the role of the political parties in those 40 years?
Well, thank you, Renard. Thank you very much. And I'll go for other questions, live questions this time. And again, please do realize that, time, we have a limit on time. So any questions that we cannot attend to or answer in this session, please forward by email to london@webuildiraq.org. Okay, a quick one, maybe it goes to Frank on oil sector. Do you think Iraq would have less pervasive corruption if the oil sector had been privatized in 2003 and 4 instead of continuing as a state-owned enterprise?
Wow. The role of oil, short answer, the role of oil is being dependent upon a single natural resource tends to lead to having a corrupt country because of the gap between the cost and the benefit. For example, it takes $12 a barrel to get a barrel of oil out of the ground and aboard a ship from Iraq. $12. You sell the oil at, what is it yesterday? Well, you sell it at over $60 a barrel. That's almost $48 of rent that can now be distributed by the government. And, that's, it seems to be, oil is a curse of Iraq. And I'm not sure how politically, and this is probably Renard's field more than mine, I'm not sure politically how you could ever separate the government from the oil revenues. Early in 2005, it was recommended that we go for the Alaskan solution, which is that the oil revenue above expenses would be divided among the Iraqi people, that every Iraqi would get a monthly check, 6,000 dinars, your share of the oil money. Well, that didn't happen, and it wasn't going to happen. So oil is the curse of Iraq, but it would be much worse if Iraq didn't have the oil. So this is a question I can't answer.
Okay, Frank, again, back to you. It's a question addressed to you challenges you about your sources for adopting or getting details about the complexity of the commerce law. And says that relying on warehouse license story should not be enough to judge commercial activities and processes in Iraq. And that there are businesses in Iraq finalizing transactions every day smoothly without paying a penny.
Oh, I don't disagree with that message at all. And if you are a large domestic, which are very few, or a large international organization, then you can hire some excellent firms, some of which I think are members of the IBBC, who will actually facilitate such. They will make sure you get all the licenses and all the approvals. Now, I note that even some of the major companies, I see the international oil companies are having difficulty between worker permits and worker visas, which are, it used to be if you had a visa, it implied that your person could work. Now the government is saying you need both a worker visa and a worker permit. But that's not where the job creation occurs. The job creation doesn't occur in very large companies and very large international firms, not just in Iraq, but across the developing world. It's the small firms, it's the ma and pa firms that hire 2 workers that create the jobs. And they do not have the access of hiring a very active, very capable firm of doing all their necessary contracts and agreements and getting permission and making sure that everything is signed. It's interesting that Iraq still requires wet signatures on government documents instead of electronic signatures. They still require live rubber stamps. If you're a large firm, you can hire an expert to do it for you. But what if you're a small firm in Nasiriyah that wants to expand from 2 employees to 4 employees? It is very difficult. It is very expensive.
Thank you, Frank. Maya, there's a question, and it seems the question is in defense of Iraqi judicial system, and says that it suggests the question that you are a bit harsh, and you don't have reliable sources or concrete data or statistics before attacking the judicial system in Iraq.
Sure, I mean, something we're very used to, I think.
And honestly, before you answer this, I tend to agree somehow with this. I think the judiciary in Iraq, maybe there's some corruption, but compared to others, it's the least corrupt. At least
compared to other systems in Iraq, or compared to other judiciary systems in the region?
No, to other systems in Iraq. Yeah, well, that's my personal comment, but that's a question to you.
Okay, no, I think that's a valid point, but I think repeatedly the cases that we had heard about when I was based in Iraq with AFP was about a failure to be able to implement, for example, arrest warrants that were issued by the Integrity Commission. Or the fact that you have MPs repeatedly going on television and saying, I'm corrupt. I was corrupt. I accepted bribes for 1, 2, 3. And did those people serve jail time? I mean, that I think is a relevant question. I will say this was a story that I wanted to do but did not get the chance to fully investigate. But that doesn't mean that the perceived corruption and the perceived kind of lack of, I mean, the fact that citizens feel like they cannot rely on the courts for a lasting and just conclusion to a corruption case tells you a lot. But I'd be happy, I think it was Ms. Hadil that posed the question, but I'd be happy to discuss with her more. I believe she has a legal background as well. So I would love to hear.
So Maya, what you say practically is that corruption could also, not taking action could also be seen as corruption or is corruption. That's your point.
The job of the court is to hold people to account. So it's not just the idea of, you know, was there a case that was raised and it was not resolved in a desirable or in a just way. But I mean, are there people going around admitting they were corrupt and not getting put in jail?
Okay. Well, thank you. Valid point. Renard.
If I could just jump in here,
Yes, please.
I was looking at some survey data, and 22% of Iraqis said they paid a bribe to somebody in the judiciary within the last year. So it may be relatively uncorrupt compared to other institutions in Iraq, but 22% of the population has had to pay a bribe in the last year. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Renard, the question is about the political system and says that the political system is the root of the problem. How does one start to modify and clean up a system or the system? Those who should start such a fundamental reform program are those who benefit from this system itself. How can the reform be undertaken and by whom? And I think it refers, how can reform of the political system be undertaken? Renard,
Sure. And just quickly, if I can agree with Maya and Frank, you know, it's the judiciary really that's at the heart of why there is no enforcement of corruption. So I think you're right, Shwan, in saying that more money is being taken in other systems than the judges and lawyers aren't taking the money, but they're not doing their job. And not doing their job, they're allowing for the money to not go to the Iraqi people, which is a crime. And when you look at anti-corruption measures, every time I hear about a corruption case, the first question I ask, and maybe I'm biased for my sort of what I'm researching, the first question I ask is, well, who's behind this, right? Because there's no way that certain political parties that are in power will allow for their people to get arrested. So there's always a political element behind, or let's say in many cases, there's political elements behind who gets a warrant and who doesn't get a warrant. There's decisions being made, who is touchable and who is untouchable. And those are questions I think that are very important in looking at the role of anti-corruption legislature historically, since 2003, I think. On the question of the political system and the roots, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what I mentioned previously on enforcing accountability is important, because there is a logic to the political system. And that part of that logic is this pact between the different political parties. And so it's very difficult for one person or one group within that to say, okay, I'm going to start going after corruption, because they then get turned, you know, they lose. So it has to come, I think, not from within. And I think we should move away from this idea that you could have reformers from within the system, but it has to come through civil society, through, as I said, journalism, through lawyers, through legal mechanisms, through civil servants within the system that may be empowered when connected with each other. But these initiatives, I think, are long-term, not short-term, and will you know, are unlikely to kind of work unless all put together. But I think that has to be the key. I mean, most Iraqis talk about corruption, but I don't think there until now is enough out there in the literature, in the newspapers, on the extent of this corruption and how, but you know, how to move up on.
Well, thank you very much, Renard. Really interesting. I got another question, but on a personal channel, not on this, on a WhatsApp message, by a WhatsApp message, not on the chat channel. And that is, I mean, focus is always on the government, but what about the public? What about you touched, I mean, you guys, all of you touched, the three of you touched on the issue of protesters and others. But really, again, this is the public contributing to corruption if the public do not participate in corrupt practices. How can corruption survive? So it's a two-sided thing. I mean, Maya, you seem to have an answer for that.
You know what? It's because I often was prompted to think about it in the reverse, not just, you know, if the public does not take part in corruption, can corruption survive? But more, if the public does not take part in corruption, can the public survive? I mean, these are families tell me all the time that they you know, when they go to let's say a doctor and they're getting a prescription for a particular kind of medication, they find out after some searches at their local pharmacies that the doctor has made a deal with a pharmacy that's under his clinic to only prescribe that medication specifically because that pharmacy provides it, and he gets a kickback from the sales that they make from that medicine. So there's an overwhelming sense among people that they would not be able to survive if they did not take part in this corruption. They need to get a certain piece of paperwork done, otherwise they're going to be put in jail. I mean, that's a very real choice that people are making. And so they're going to pay that small fee because they don't want to get put in jail for not having for having some kind of expiration on their ID or something like that. I mean, these are people that, you know, that are really forced into the system. It's not that they choose to. And they're often people that do not have, I mean, they're not wealthy. They're not people that have the financial resources to kind of get favors or expedite a process that they'd be willing to wait for. I mean, they really cannot wait for that process to happen. So yeah, I think, I mean, I do have also, you know, friends and colleagues that refuse to engage in any kind of bribery, and they've taken a position against doing that. And even here in Beirut as well. But it just seems, you know, a lot of people just tell me that it's hard to live that way. And it doesn't necessarily, you know, refraining from an individual perspective from engaging in that system is not really going to cause that system to collapse, because the benefit is happening way beyond that individual choice. The parties that are engaging in it are much bigger and at a much higher level than just those individuals who are paying the small bribes.
Well, Maya, thank you very much. And I think we are running out of time, but I'll go for one final comment by Frank and Renard, and 1 minute each before closing up. Thank you, Frank.
Yes, I think Renard raised the key issue is, where do you start? Where can you get the traction? And that is the biggest challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renard. Your final comment, if you have any. Thank you.
I mean, I guess that's, I hope, a question that we can continue discussing and working on. Where do you start? And to conclude, I think Maya's point is important, and Frank writes about in the paper that, you know, most of the people that we talk to who pay bribes, they pay bribes to parties that they disagree with and they don't want the system, but at the end of the day, they have no choice, right? At the end of the day, to survive, they have, this is, and I think that's a very important point, I think, to conclude with, that there, and Frank talks about the generational divide and the changes, the demographic change is huge, because every year more and more people will be outside of that system. And so the pressure on the system, I think, will continue, and that's something to also sort of look out for.
Well, thank you. And Maya, your final go with a final comment. Thank you.
No, I'm just really happy that we're having continued discussion about this and really getting to the root of the issue. And hopefully we'll have many more sessions like this where we can dive into the political settlement portion of the root of the problem. So thanks again to everyone for their comments.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the attendees. And I'm being bombarded by messages, WhatsApp messages. Why don't you go for my question? And so I'm sorry, we don't have time. We have 1 hour, and the hour is over. So please forward your questions again to London by email to london@webuildIraq.org. Thank you very much. Thank you for the panelists. Really interesting and very useful points you raised. Thank you for all who attended from all over the world. We have attendees from the United States, from Europe, from the UK, from Jordan, from Egypt, from Iraq, of course, and so from all the continents. And Thank you very much. Wish you all the best and have a good day and happy iftar for those who are fasting. Thank you.